Hi, everyone. My name is Chaka Grier, and I am the host of this panel, Palatable for What? And I want to say hi to all you guys because this is the first time we've seen each other all together. So we're going to dive right in, and I want to start off with introducing our guests. So I'm going to quickly read this. Indulge me. Tarun Nayar is a DJ, producer, and tabla player who's the founder of the band Delhi to Dublin, and is the executive director of 5X Fest and co-founder of Snakes and Ladders. We have Alanna Stuart, one half of the band Bon J, indie dancehall music maker, associate producer at CBC, and independent scholar. And we have Nicholas Dourado. He leads the Booty Band. They are a teacher and organizer and hold a master's degree in ocean geophysics and acoustics. So it's great to meet you all. And let's dive right in because we have a lot of terrain to cover as we've all been discussing. And I want to start with the first half, which is, as BIPOC artists, there's a lot of boxes you're typically, the industry tries to put you in. And I was sharing with Alanna and Nick that when I interviewed FK Twigs a few years ago, she mentioned that before the public saw her, her music was being described as experimental and indie and all these other forms. But when they saw that she was mixed race, they started describing her as R&B and various labels that are attached to Black female musicians. So let's start with you, Alanna. You started in the R&B industry and you moved into the indie scene. Talk about your experience.
So I started off in the industry proper quite young. I was in high school when I released my first single on the radio. And so that means that the foundation of my experience was commercially driven and all the expectations that are attached to that. And at that time, Canadian music, the urban scene, I was an R&B singer, was mostly concerned with American pop success. And so that made it a very studied experience for me. The managers and the producers that I was working with, they had a template that they expected me to follow. And that included changing my name Alanna Stuart because it wasn't deemed Black or urban enough. For my promo photos, they had a particular aesthetic with really thick gold chains, my shirt buttoned down to reveal a certain amount of cleavage. It was very, very, the box was very rigid and unoriginal, quite frankly. And so when I released my first single, and heard that it was under another name without my knowledge, I decided to leave the industry and I just headed to university like a good child of immigrant parents. But music still was with me. And in campus community radio, it wasn't just the indie scene that I discovered. It was this limitless access to all kinds of sounds. And it became a choose your own adventure musically for me. And at that time I was still making music, but it was with a new mindset. It was in this indie community that was very anti-commercial. And therefore, I didn't feel like I had the same mental constraints. Even though my sound was similar, my mindset was different. And I felt free to roam. And it was around this time where I'm encountering these new sounds. I'm meeting bands like Local Rabbits. I'm meeting an early Sam Roberts. This was when the Canadian indie scene was very, very. It was in its infancy, and we were all mixing. I was hearing these indie sounds, but dancehall reggae wasn't leaving me. R&B wasn't leaving me. So when I met my bandmate Ian Swain at a party called Disorganized, which sonically is exactly as you'd imagine it, I had these ingredients to create new sounds with. And that became the foundation of Bon J. I would sing with my R&B voice that I started with, but I would do dancehall reggae covers of indie songs. So our first single was actually a cover of this band out of New York called Yeah Yeah Yeahs over a dancehall 45 that Diplo Yeah. So we mixed that with dancehall, and Diplo got a copy, and now Bonjay is here. Yeah, so that's the
Diplo's a.
Say it again.
I was going to say Diplo's a controversial figure, which I love his music, but we'll leave it there. But I want to mention, before I move to Tarun, you mentioned something interesting, that you don't find that the same restrictions that Black women musicians in Canada and America have is the same in other parts like Jamaica and the UK. So can you explain that a bit? Okay, I'll switch over to you, but I just want to finish with Alanna, because you mentioned to me that the kind of boxes Black female singers are put in Canada and America, you don't find that in Jamaica or the UK and some other places. So can you briefly just share that experience? Or is it less?
I mean, I wouldn't say that I don't feel the constraints in Jamaica at all. I think that as a Black female artist, I've always felt that my role in the industry, my value in the industry was based on how much I can contribute to somebody else's practice. I don't feel that my practice on its own has been considered as valuable. So in Jamaica, I'm hyper aware of my femininity, and I'm in predominantly male studios within a patriarchal society, and I remember speaking about the feeling of navigating dancehall reggae production studios as someone who didn't have any network in Jamaica before 3 years ago. I built it slowly by just randomly introducing myself to producers I'd meet at parties, and the risk involved in that as a woman. To account for that risk, I would desexualize myself as much as possible. I wouldn't wear makeup. I'd wear sweatshirts or baggier clothes just to signal that I'm here for the music, and try to hide my body as a woman. In Canada, I'm hyper aware of my Blackness, because in indie spaces it's monochromatic, to put it diplomatically. And so I don't, in the UK, I think I remember going to the UK maybe 15 years ago, and there was it was just this inherent feeling that I almost can't describe. I just felt at home. And I think it was because, reflecting back on it, I think it's because I saw so many different expressions of Blackness. I felt relieved of having to be only one thing. And so out of those places, I would say the UK. I mean, it's the UK. So, I'm not ignorant of racism that exists there. But in terms of contemporary culture and my feelings on the ground there, being in a club where, you could listen to breakbeat, to soul R&B, to dancehall, and there are representational mixes or expressions of Black music. I would say the UK is where I felt most at home, because I've just felt a sense of possibility there.
Okay. I want to move over to Tarun, because you mix South Asian music with electronic. You have the band Delhi to Dublin. So did you feel when you began your career that the sounds you were creating were considered, did you feel like you had space to create those sounds and support to create those sounds? Or was it a challenge?
Yeah. So as a bit of background, when we started the band in 2006, it was really just supposed to be a one-time thing. It was almost like one of those collaborations that happens at a festival. None of us set out to start a band that mixed all of that stuff together. But one of the things that we've often said is, when people are like, well, how did you get the crazy idea to blend, tabla and electronic music? It's like, well, that's what I grew up playing. So that's what we used. Like, it never occurred to me to use a guitar, because I didn't grow up playing guitar. I grew up playing tabla and, dole and all of the Punjabi instruments. So I think I grew up in Montreal, and I definitely didn't really feel the same kind of freedom as I felt in Montreal as I do feel in Vancouver. I feel like in Vancouver there is, although there is this kind of weird segregation here between, especially like Asian populations, white populations, and South Asian populations. People are like, "Oh, Vancouver's so diverse," but it's not really diverse in the way that it operates on a day-to-day basis. Let alone the fact that there are essentially, I think just a few thousand Black people, like in British Columbia. It's crazy. So I think that being in Vancouver for some reason was freeing, and I think it's because there's so many South Asians here that we did have a bit of freedom to do whatever the heck we wanted to do. But to tell you the truth, it was really Americans that opened to us before Canadians did. It wasn't until we were playing like the California festival circuit that we started to get bookings in Canada.
Mm-hmm. That seems to be a similar story where Canadian artists have to go abroad in order to get the attention they deserve for their music. And I just want to move over to Nick. You told me something interesting, that you've kind of avoided boxes because of the teachers and the mentors that guided your teachers that influenced your music.
Oh no, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Sorry, could you just repeat the question? Just then was when it cut out for me.
Okay, so you mentioned to me that many ways you formed the way you approach music and think about music due to the teacher that mentored you as you've been creating music, and that's helped you to avoid some of the restrictions and boxes that the industry tries to put on people of color. So can you discuss that a bit?
Yeah, I think I've maybe managed to avoid it a little bit, but I also feel like I've had to confront it a lot, especially because I just feel like I was fortunate to, while I was learning about music and also trying to become a pop star and sell my music in whatever the commercial sphere of music was, that I met a musician who also taught and held a class in 1313 Hollis, a small building on the waterfront in Halifax, that we paid $5 for 2 hours, and he would be there every week. And he is in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and has played on some of the most famous jazz records and is friends with some of the most important musicians in the world today. And they all sort of said the same thing to us, which was like, go for it if you want to, but know that one day your phone will stop ringing all at the same time. And, they've sort of had careers that were all 60 years long and have gone through that cycle many times. And part of what they would remind us about was that you just will actually always have this practice if you keep it. And that was just really strange to me, because being a pop star for decades at that point, I'd never really heard anybody even mention the word practice, let alone that it was an essential part of what we were doing. And so I think one of the things I've been trying to do is just try to fold that idea of practice. I think especially again when there's a conversation about cultural appropriation, or what this these cultural artifacts are that you're working with, which is music, it's actually deeply important to the identity of all the people in the world that we have a just and equitable way to speak about what the art objects are and where they came from, and why it's important that they survive, and why it's important that we protect them and acknowledge the history.
Yes. Mm-hmm. I think what you're saying here shifts us into the next part of the discussion. The meat of this discussion is, one of the things is gatekeepers. gatekeepers who draw from different cultures and gatekeepers who mainstream music that come from very important groups of people who don't have the access and power that these gatekeepers do. And Alanna, you've been in your scholarship, you've been working right now on studying the Canadian music industry and the role that gatekeepers play. So can you discuss that? Because one thing I find is a lot of younger artists and artists in general feel that, oh, there's no gatekeepers. You know, I can put my music up independently, but there's gatekeepers exist and they're just as powerful, usually just as white and usually just as male. So can you discuss what you're looking at? Some of the...
Yeah, I think one, to manage expectations. When I say independent scholar, what I mean is I've studied a thing and it's not affiliated with anybody. It was motivated internally based on my own personal experience. It was funded independently, and I think that's important to note, because it speaks to my experience as a Black woman in the industry, and how that's impacted how I see my place in it. My experience being a Black woman in the Canadian indie industry, which is predominantly white, put me in this place of outsider or observer. And at some point, I started noticing that as the indie scene became more commercially viable, we were still maintaining the language of progressives, and we were still championing, you know, at events, people would post signage saying no racism, no sexism, no homophobia, no transphobia. And this was important and I think right to do. But then when I was looking around the room, you know, 10 years into the music industry, it was still white. And so we were theoretically progressive, theoretically open, but I couldn't help but look at just factually, just looking around the room, we weren't progressing. But I had faith. I was, you know, having conversations with people in my community, I had faith in their intention, but there was a gap between intention and action. There was a gap between, you know, the signage and the audience or the people in the community itself. But I didn't want to leave it because, you know, this was a community that gave me a sense of freedom when I was leaving the commercial industry as a teenager. And so I wanted to understand what was happening. And also, being one of the only Black women in the industry, I think this study also came out of a moment of self-questioning. I didn't feel at that time, because we weren't talking about identity politics in the same way, I didn't feel validated enough. I didn't feel brave or strong enough to say, hey, you notice that the room still looks the same? I had to embark on a years-long study and partner with an incredible research partner, Dr. Kim Dourado, sociologist from U of T, to start asking directly of the industry, okay, when we talk about diversity, first of all, what do we even mean? How does it show up in our work? Why do we care about it? Do we actually care about it? You know, or is it nice to say? And people were exceptionally honest, shockingly honest sometimes. And it gave me insight into some of, you know, how gatekeeping works, or the boxes. And, you know, even using the word gatekeeping and white men, I think we're so numb to that language. I think we're all past that. And this language and this awareness of the language is I think more symptomatic of our culture. What I wanted to understand is what was leading to the necessity of that language, what was leading to the necessity of these movements. And in talking to people directly, we started to get a sense of the inner life, the very human life, you know, the way we socialize, the way we network, the way we love, the way we listen to music. That helped me understand what was happening. And so you know, we learned a lot, but in the context of this talk, when we talk about boxes, we learned about who was creating the boxes, but more importantly, what was reinforcing it. So when I talk about being in that room and it's still looking a certain way, but people talking, you know, we're co-opting the language of progress, but we're not actually behaving progressively. I wanted to understand what was upholding the box. And something that came up was we learned about, well, during the study, there was sociological theory that was published that spoke about the importance of diversity or representation, inclusion, equity at an organizational level to really, you know, look at the impact of diversity at that level and the trickle-down effect, and how that impacts who gets presented, how they're presented, etc. So say you have a predominantly white organization. Okay, well, we're in the music business and we're about making money. Well, we're seeing that the quote unquote urban music scene has a huge audience, and yet the engagement with, we're not seeing much representation of Black executives at an organizational level. So how does that happen? We learned through this study the importance of social networks. If you're not, you know, many people got their jobs through people that they know. If you're not socializing with certain groups, then it's highly unlikely that you'll refer them for the job. But something that I think was enlightening, and in retrospect probably doesn't seem like such a surprise, was in Canada specifically the importance of funding bodies to maintaining the boxes that we fit in or the boxes that we tick. And if you actually, we didn't have to do a research study to do this. If you actually look at the guidelines of certain funding bodies, they talk about, they expect you to outline how you are meeting the needs of what are considered priority groups. So that could be what are called racialized artists, artists with disabilities, Indigenous artists, etc. So you're an organization. We operate in a capitalist systems where we're about making that money, but money is limited. But here we have a granting body that says, well, we have a little bit of money for you. So then you don't have to invest as much of your own money to turn a profit. Now, in order to get that money, you have to show that you are meeting the needs or at least engaging with these priority groups. My concern is that relationship between diversity and the funding, and how that motivates certain action, and how certain groups are engaged with. And I could speak more to that, but I want to actually share a quote from the research study that speaks to the impact of this, because I just shared a lot, right? But in practical terms, one white male manager, we'll call him Sheldon. We're protecting the identities of the participants. So his name is not actually Sheldon. It said, sometimes when you work with diversity artists, the thing is that you can weaponize diversity. In other words, access to grants turned what Sheldon described as a niche artist into a more viable client, which Sheldon shared made it possible to create more opportunities for that artist. And so you see how the impact of, in talking to some of the industry members, we learned how quotas, be it fear of public pressure, fear of losing out on grants, impacted how we engage with BIPOC artists. And as a result, if we're talking about fitting in boxes from non-white artist perspective, that then shapes, that determines how we contort ourselves to fit into the boxes that these organizations are expected to tick. And so one artist communicated how, what did they say again? They had said, so it's like a kind of double-edged sword where I'm resentful of the box, but I will cross it off if it means I can access funding, And so it becomes a weather vane that we operate against. It becomes the box, and I don't want to monopolize the time, and I can feel myself getting so excited and wanting to share more, because I feel like this is there's so much information from this study that I want to reflect back to the industry, because even after doing this study, there was a moment where I thought, okay, well, music is not going to happen for me. It's impossible. But coming out of it, I think that it highlighted an opportunity for a new way. And it goes back to Nick's point of practice rather than career, but really thinking about music as a practice. And when we look to the UK, when we look to Jamaica, when we look to the US, we can see how when you're focused on just being like just pure badness, just trying to be the best and trying to make something new and be original, that there's benefit to that as well. So I had, I have all these notes, and I intended for this to be more organized in thought. But in short, I did this study to understand what's shaping the box, what's reinforcing the box, and what happens, what's necessary to fit within the box. But also, I'd like to speak a little bit later about what happens when
Alanna,
Am I allowed to swear?
I want to speak because Nick is also doing a study that's important, so we can tie that in.
Please do. Yes, please do.
Yeah. Okay. So Nick, like Alanna, and maybe on a more smaller level, but just as important, you're doing your own study. Can you describe that to me? Using community people?
Yeah. For us, it's actually less of a study, and like sort of what we call it is an accountability group.
Okay.
Because one of the things that my teacher had passed on to me was when I had talked to him about wanting to start a little saxophone group with another saxophone player in the ensemble. He was like, "Yeah, you can do it. You just have to make sure to keep each other accountable 100% of the time, and always call each other out on when you're not playing the best. Always." And of course we didn't do it because it's too hard. Like, nobody has the guts to tell their fellow musician, like, "No, I hate it." Although our teacher would do it to us all the time. And he was like, if you don't even know when it feels good or when it doesn't feel good, then is this okay? And so our idea again was to just start an accountability group, which is just an email that we send out every week. And then we ask people questions and then ask them to sort of send their answers back to us. And in a particular way, I think it really does look like a study. And a lot of people who are involved have been asking us what we want to do with the information. And the truth is, we don't want to do anything with the information.
Okay.
Chaka?
Sorry about that. Can you hear me? Okay, Nick, let me finish with you. Can you just you mentioned to me about blackface and minstrelsy as part of this accountability group. Can you just briefly explain what that's about?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing that really changed my life as a musician was to start to learn about the history of the music industry, which is vile, horrible, colonizing. Like, actually, I don't even know if there is a better thing to study than the creation of an industry around music to understand what people are talking about when we're talking about colonialism. Who consented to the performances in the way they are? Who consented to this ethnic tradition being put in these places? Like, how did it start? And one thing that I don't think a lot of musicians know but need to know is that blackface minstrelsy is how performance started in what we today call North America. It is the seed of the music industry that we participate in today. And I also think too, like, less I have this question for like the European settlers that we interact with, but those of us who also like come from histories of our ancestors surviving colonialism, like we need to know. We need to know like when we are actually enforcing a system of colonial supremacy, and like when we're working against it. And honestly, like I want to tour the world and make money and sell records that I make so badly, as much as anyone. But like if it actually means that we're doing it in order to keep the indigenous people of the world without their power, their inherent power, then that's wrong.
Yes.
And
that brings me to...
the last thing I was going to say is just the fact that we can't name it just makes it like where we're stuck. But
yeah, that brings me to you, Tarun, because 5X Fest really is about, you told me how Afrofest was a big influence on the kind of idea of 5X Fest, which is for South Asian youth. So can you kind of discuss how you're using the festival to bypass gatekeepers who have left a lot of South Asian youth out of music, and how you're creating it for these young people?
Yeah, for sure. I just wanted to freaking bow down to Alanna. Thank you for the work that you've done. That's freaking awesome. And I really appreciated your share, and Nick as well. Just such valuable stuff. I've been on a lot of these panels over the last 2 months, as I'm sure you have too. And it's nice to get some real substance. You know, it's just so great. So just a moment on the you know, I sort of, you know, listening to Alanna's share, you know, I'm on the Factor Diversity and Inclusivity Committee, but I also continue to kind of rail against, like, we all know that we're disproportionately funding acts that even with Factor, so Factor is about commercial music, but it's well known that Factor continues to disproportionately fund genres that aren't commercially viable, but they happen to be the white genres. So just for example, Factor's budget that they give away in 2018 was $19 million. 30 to 40% of this went towards like alt, indie, and rock. But the top streamers for the last decade, if we look at streaming numbers from Canadian artists for the last decade, have been Black artists or artists who are playing, you know, ostensibly, you know, Black music. And these genres are getting 3% of the cut from Factor, which is just so outrageous that you know, it's just so blatant that when people are like, well, I don't really know, you know, I'm not really sure if this is a thing. You're like, well, just look at the numbers. Like, this is half of the money from Factor is public funding. So this is tax dollars that are going towards funding stuff that has to be, you know, the Factor there shouldn't be like any kind of subjectivity. It's like commercially successful music should get funded by Factor. And yet the music that we're hearing on the radio and the music that's being supported by Factor, like, nothing agrees. So, I mean, that's one thing that goes through my head. The second thing is that, you know, I think that Marlon James said a few years ago, like, it's not BIPOC folks, it's not people of color who should be on these panels. It's the gatekeepers that should be on these panels, because they're the ones that have to do the reckoning. Like, why is it that your festival is not booking BIPOC artists? Why is it that your board has no BIPOC people on it? I think that, you know, I was just watching the last group of people talking before we were on. We were sort of in the side, and that was a largely, you know, a group of largely white folks. And I just think that, again, like, that does not, I understand, you know, like, I've been in the industry here for 20 years. I understand that these things happen, but at the same time, like, that doesn't represent the artists who are actually playing music, and it doesn't represent the face of our cities. And we have to get a heck of a lot better. And it's really like white people that should be on these panels talking about, like, why are you keeping artists out? You know, like, why are you not diversifying your board? Like, why are you not putting BIPOC folks in positions of power in your organization? Because you can talk all you like and post your black squares, but until you actually give power nothing changes. And so those are some reflections on, you know, what has just been talked about. But in terms of our festival, yeah, I think it came through frustration. So I'm heavily inspired by Afropunk. I think that it is, you know, it's like every large organization, it has its challenges. But I think the, you know, by us, for us mentality, being so, you know, I grew up in, you know, sort of heavily invested in the sort of South Asian music thing. And in Vancouver, we have a huge South Asian population. And I got so frustrated from us being the sort of like dancing monkeys on stage approach to selling our culture. Like, yeah, sure, let's dance around on stage and try to get, you know, try to get people to pay attention to us. I'm like, you know, fuck that. Let's hold a big festival for ourselves. There's 400,000 odd South Asians in the Lower Mainland. And, you know, glean whatever resources we can and do a festival for ourselves where we're not trying to sell our culture outside, where we can just be ourselves. And I think that that's like a key thing that I've learned from organizations like Afropunk and even everyday people. I mean, there's so much to learn from the Black community, especially, you know, outside of Vancouver, let's say in Toronto or the States, in terms of like, how can we support our culture and stop infighting and provide a platform for our youth in a way that's not like patronizing, but in a way that's relevant and in a way that will, you know, will redistribute power in an effective way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We actually have a question for you, Tarun. Someone's asking, what is the mandate of the D&I committee? Is it empowered to make program changes?
No, it's not currently. And I encourage you to, you know, post on Factor and talk to them. I mean, I've known and have been the beneficiary of Factor's programs ever since I, you know, sort of came up like 15 years ago in my band. And it's ridiculous, like the lack of equitability in the funding needs immediate disruption. And I think that disruption can only come when people actually are talking about it, and especially when white people are talking about it. When a bunch of BIPOC folks are like, hey, it's not fair, that's one thing. But when white people are like, hey, it's not fair, I would encourage you to post on their Facebook page and on their Instagram and be like, what's up, you know?
Yeah, I love that. Let's get to Nick. We're moving into the third part now. And Nick, one of the things you said is you think that people of color should just withdraw from the capitalist system of music. Am I correct on that, or can you explain your belief? Should we be trying to work within this system that's broken, or just simply create our own and withdraw?
Well, it's just interesting because this system that's broken is like an infant compared to the age of the traditions and the musics that we are working with. Like, all of the world's music has been around for long before there were barter systems. And like, I think this kind of comes up a lot in this idea of like where we're going to, where I think people want to try to figure out a new way to sell the musical art objects. But like, we don't often think about going backwards as well and into looking, I mean, because again, like all our people have been on this earth for tens of thousands of years before capitalism and colonialism was the only way in which people understood each other. And like the fact, like, I don't even think it's that, I think we do have to divest because, and I mean, I kind of think that this is why part of the responsibility of like the music journalism in the whole world also becomes like, we need to start actually teaching some people about the history of what this is and what we're doing. Because I think the question of this panel too is palatable to who, right? And
yes,
I think the answer to that question, when I saw it, was 100% obvious, which is to settlers. Like, if you live in settler apartheid, that's a genocidal settler apartheid, no one in the world can find out about it. And part of the reason why those systems ended in places like South Africa is because the artists didn't let the government get away with running a settler apartheid. And like by giving us that money, you have to sign off on somehow the idea that Canada is a real nation, which it's not, and it's just a state that's been plunked down into another way of life. And our music work and the music work of the Indigenous people of the world carries that truth indelibly. That's what we all have. Like, we can point that to any governmental system in the world, any system of imperialism and apartheid in the world, and like, I just think it's really too bad that quote unquote Canadian musicians don't have solidarity with the anti-apartheid movements of the world, because our government fills our pockets. And because also another one of the things that I feel like I should say is I've never gotten any money from Factor. And I've been a musician for like 15 years. I play a lot of instruments. I played in a lot of bands. I've played with bands that have been supported by Factor in really small ways. But I think one of the things that comes up too, and Alanna brought this up and I really wanted to speak on it, is this idea that like part of the reason why we feel like we have to sign off on it is because without the money, it just becomes too hard to operate. Like, you can't afford the publicity, or the PR, all that stuff, which is so expensive. For really bad PR, you have to spend $2,000. And for a band that makes $100 per gig, like, it isn't, like, they're literally trying to take all the money and put it back into the hands of the rich and powerful already, who are just doing propaganda. And that's the thing, right? It's like we always think that you actually need money to have music, but music's been around for way longer than there's been money. And we, as musicians, make the money happen. And like the fact that there has been, like, that's why the capitalism in music has been so important, is to actually keep musicians feeling that if they don't have that investment, the music will stop. But if we divest, if we don't give that cultural identity, that nationalism, that nationhood to Canada, then they will be absent of it, which will make it clear that it's a settler apartheid nation. It has no real relationship to the people. So I just think that that's kind of what our responsibility is.
I think that's incredible. And it brings me back to Alanna, because you have an Audre Lorde quote that speaks to that so powerfully. Can you share that?
Yeah, I wanted to go back and touch on a couple of things that Nick had said that came up in the study, but might be helpful in breaking down, because we hear words like apartheid and colonial, and we think, but those are evil slave owners. I'm not that. I am far from that. But when you think about how the culture that came from those systems and those practices and that hurt, and it doesn't evaporate with time. It has to go somewhere. I think that it's with this study, it brought to light how those systems show up in the everyday, in the ways, the social ways that we take for granted. And it would come up in quotes like one agent who had said, folk music is white people music, and that there's so much in that sentence of like, okay, well, folk music is people's music. So what people are we talking about? And if folk music is white people's music, are white people the only people making music? You know what I mean? It's just, it's ignorant of the subtleties and the depth and nuance of everyday human experience. It's ignorant of, it doesn't take into account the colonial systems that eliminated certain people from the category of folk music, that would lead to that simple quote, that simple everyday belief that folk music is white people music. And so I do think that understanding that history is important. And I also think using everyday language is important to show us the ways it appears in our lives, the ways that we take for granted. When I also have to say, with the granting system, I've gotten grants from every single granting body, from Factor, Canada Council for the Arts, Ontario Arts Council, Toronto Arts Council. I've gotten a lot of financial support. And when I trace back to when I started getting them, when my application stopped failing, is when I started asking for feedback. Like, what were people saying about the music? And it was oftentimes it wasn't even about the music. It's like, oh, well, you said you make bass heavy music, but then you submitted a song that had 0 bass in it. So it kind of like was incongruous. But that labor involved in having to go and meet those people, the time involved, all of that took away from energy I could have been contributing to my music. And it is a double-edged sword, because on one hand, there's a limit to how much grants can help you, can push you in an upward trajectory. And I do want to read this quote from a label staff member, Sarah, a white female manager, who had said, when you apply for a grant, you can check, women or Indigenous or disability, but then if these people aren't supported on the other side, then it doesn't help. For example, the grants won't have the same impact if the systems in the industry don't support the execution of the project. I've worked with an artist where I was at X record label. I managed her with her partner, and I just saw the label fumble it because, she's a woman and Muslim and North African, and they don't know how to market that. If it doesn't fit the quote unquote white man channel, you need someone to help you market that and reach a wider audience. And because music and art is meaningful, but it's also a lot about PR and likes. And as an artist, you'll pay your PR so much more money. Yes, the recording is expensive, but what will happen is an artist gets a $30,000 grant, record the artist, but then they can't go on tour because they don't have anyone to book shows. It's a holistic thing. And so, in my experience, I've thought, well, I don't want to speak against funding bodies because Bonjay was able to turn down a record deal that didn't serve our artistry well, and we were able to release our own records. But I can feel the ceiling that we hit without the infrastructure to be able to support us to a certain level, or to bypass gatekeepers, to give us access to a wider audience. And so in terms of what Nick was mentioning, I do think it's important for me to recognize how the granting systems have afforded me development opportunities that I just couldn't afford on my own, but I feel were necessary. But at the same time, you get stuck in this box, and a box isn't just related to your identity, but I think a box around your practice, a box around your self-conception, a box around your network, a box around your practice, it becomes limited. And your energy and your time gets funneled into applications and even how you contextualize yourself to meet these priority groups. I remember having this sensation in my body of, I keep talking about being a Black woman, and I know that I am. It's truthful, so it's not a lie. But I'm also hyper aware of how this reads. And so I just stopped applying for certain grants if it didn't feel right. And I actually said in my grants, I am aware of the fact that I'm a Black woman, and I know this is what this means. And then I started to push against that box. And my artistry has been driven by pushing against the box. But I'm going to get to that Audre Lorde quote now, but I want to give a little bit of context and personal experience around why this quote was important to me. Something that I mentioned earlier. And children, if you are listening, don't repeat what Auntie Alanna is about to say, but fuck the box. Fuck the box. And I don't mean that in the sense of you don't have to fit in it. Ignore it altogether, because we did not create it. Whether your relationship to the box is contorting to fit within it, whether you are hyper aware of its presence and you're actively pushing against it, or if you're like me, for a while I thought that I was operating alongside it. Forget it. That is energy and attention that is being put into a way of being, a way of practicing, a way of creating that wasn't determined by you. So fuck the box and create your own way. And I also say that because coming up in the indie scene, I had to come up against my own insecurity of how true is my blackness as someone who grew up in predominantly white areas and moved through predominantly white scene. Am I being a good black artist, whatever that means? That is a box. And I think as black artists have also created our own box, because I feel that if I were to only do what is considered the black thing, I would be limiting my artistry. And what is considered blackness, or who define blackness, is often not black people. Our expression is our own, but how it's categorized or defined or marketed, I don't need the study to, just speaking from my own experience, it hasn't quite always felt like mine. And if I didn't like the yeah, if I was overly concerned with appearing to be white and not wanting to cover the yeah, then Bonjay would never exist. And I'm telling you that the indie community does not get credit for my music. That comes from a dance hall practice tradition of badness, of always wanting to be original, of working with what you have, of constantly working in the studio and being unconcerned with outside influence. That is black. I am black, and I've always wanted to be. But if I'm operating according to the box, then I'm limiting what black expression can be, and white people get to culturally roam as much as they want to. Why can't I, And so going back to that Audre Lorde quote, the reason why I think it's important to recognize the importance of owning your own identity is what Audre had to say, and what spoke to me is this quote. She said, "For Black women as well as Black men, it's axiomatic, it's unquestionable that if we do not define ourselves for ourselves, we will be defined by others for their use and to our detriment. And I absolutely refuse to erase the Black history that led to my existence, that yes, the indie community has been given credit for and has contributed to me, but is not the sole community that gets credited."
Alanna, I think all four of us on this panel you took the words right out of my spirit. It's exactly how I feel. And I think a lot of people watching this will relate to that. And we have about 5 more minutes. And I want to ask you all, feel free to jump in. Tarun, maybe you can start off. What will progress look like? Because there's a lot of window dressing around allyship and being an ally, but it's just on the window, and behind the doors, everything is the same. So what will progress look like when BIPOC artists can be autonomous in this industry,
Yeah, I think it's probably, Alanna, I'm just swimming in your spirit right now. Thank you. It's fantastic and empowering for me as well. The only thing that I've seen work is when power is transferred. When the reins are given up. And until, at least if we're talking about gatekeepers, yes, as Alanna is saying, yes, it's really our own sort of personal quests and individual, lifelong quest to find our own power and sit in our own creativity and not fit into a box. And it would certainly be helpful if, people who have power, largely white dudes, give up that power. And when it does happen, let's say, for example, with Creative BC in British Columbia, when they decided to make the CEO a brown woman, the amount of young BIPOC artists that's influenced, both, like from publishing to, music to film, is immeasurable. I mean, thousands of young artists have benefited from that one change in leadership. And so I would say give up power.
How about you, Nick?
So what I have here is I can like show and tell a little bit to answer this question too, because like, so this is a 45 that was made in Jamaica. And again, like when we're talking about a culture, or what is the future, or like talking about being independent from like the European influence, like the music was completely independent of European influence. Like they're mastered, recorded, all the instruments built. And like the thing about these records that's really fascinating is most of them don't even have names on them. Like it's like, or if they do have names on them, it'll be a different name on the front and back, but it's the same artist in the same song. It's just dubbed out on the B side. Like, I just also think too, like for us to remember that these traditions have gone nowhere, and that they are great, unmovable mountains in the landscape of human history. They'll always be there. And for us to divest from this like really weak and cheesy commercial thing that is scarcely 100 years old and has only hurt the ancestral music, like there's no need. These mastering engineers are there, like Alanna too, and this is why, like, like we can go and find them. We can just go and like actually heal all of these places where the work has been ripped apart, where communities haven't been put together, and then it's not even a question anymore. It's just like we're back to where it was.
Alanna, can you end us off with what do you want to see? What needs to be changed before we can show progress?
Well, okay, we don't have a lot of time and there's so much to say, so maybe we can chat more in the breakout. But I think two things need to be recognized. Is something that Nick talked about, is the infancy of the music industry in Canada. As a cultural system, I think that we're immature in terms of our understanding of how influence is created, or how power is created, or cultural power, and also our inability to recognize the opportunity to be cultural leaders in the world, considering all the different musical ingredients we have in the diversity of our population. I think that what's often repeated as Canadian mediocrity is a symptom of that immaturity. And, for people who are driven by money, as a capitalist system, we're a failure. So regardless of your motivation, I think that because we're young, we're still nimble, and it shouldn't take too much to create such a shift if we're all willing. The fact that, during the study and even throughout my experience, I've become aware of the fact that Canada has become essentially a distribution channel for international labels, rather than a place that a country that people come to release their music. I think says a lot about the limitation and the ceiling that exists within the Canadian music industry. So, whatever your motivation, I think that there is enough motivation to change. And bless Nick Dourado for bringing up Jamaica, because I was going to foolishly bring up the UK, and yes, it's innovative. But how about a country that's basically the size of Toronto, has created the most influential music industry in the world? I've said this before and I'll say it again, that I think that in Jamaica is to music what Silicon Valley is to technology, a place that for the past 60 years has churned out musical genres that have formed the basis of some of the most popular music in the world. Hip hop, drum and bass, jungle, garage. So much music has been based on Jamaican culture. How does that happen? Having been spending half the year there for the past 2 years, I have some answers, but that'll be for the next conversation.
Exactly. I want to thank all of you, because as we knew, this is such a huge topic. You're all so interesting that we couldn't get to all of this in an hour, but they're all available for the breakout panel. And if you've been lucky enough to get into that, continue the talk there. Thank you all. I hope to follow your work and interview you again. And thank you all for watching.
Thank you, Chaka.